Hello, you lovely students. It's so good to be with you again. Today we are going to be talking about Chapter 9, which is part of Part 4 in our textbook on leadership communication. The learning objectives for today's talk are act as a communication champion and a sense giver rather than just as an information processor. Use key elements of effective listening and understand why listening is important to leader communication. Use candor appropriately to improve communication effectiveness and recognize and apply the difference between dialogue and discussion. Incorporate metaphor and storytelling into your leadership communications. Select an appropriate communication channel for your message and effectively use social media and nonverbal communication. Communicate in a way that persuades and influences others, and effectively communicate during times of stress or crisis. These learning objectives basically come straight out of your book and refer to the major concepts in your reading. Communication. The basic definition of communication in the context of leadership is that it is a process by which information and understanding are transferred between a sender and a receiver. The nature of effective communication is cyclical in that a sender and receiver may exchange messages several times to achieve a mutual understanding. So in the graphic on this slide, it shows the circular model of interpersonal communication, being that a message contains both verbal and nonverbal symbols or gestures, and it is communicated to a receiver who interprets the message and then formulates a message in response, which then leads to their own verbal and nonverbal messaging, which is received by another recipient who interprets a message and formulates a message and becomes a sender again. And you can see that this cycle is continuous and circular, and that in this loop of communication there is great potential for error or misunderstanding to occur. Think back to when you were a kid and sometimes you played that telephone operator game where maybe you're sitting, with a group of people in a circle, and one person starts a message and whispers that message into the person sitting next to you in their ear, and then that person sends the message to the person sitting next to them, and so on and so forth until it finally goes all the way around the circle and back to the original sender. And when that sender repeats what the final communication message is, oftentimes was very different than the original message that was sent. So that's kind of an analogy for the circular model of interpersonal communication, because in the process of communicating, there are lots of things that can transpire that affect how the message is received from the sender. So the management of communication involves the traditional role of a manager being an information processor, and managers have communication responsibilities in directing and controlling things that go on within an organization, and this is one way that they establish themselves at the center of information networks to facilitate the completion of tasks. a leader as a communication champion involves three basic components of communicating. So the first piece is communication champion, where the person who is philosophically grounded in the belief that communication is essential to building trust and gaining commitment to a vision. Okay, so that's basically talking about being able to communicate effectively, clearly, concisely, succinctly, truthfully, honestly, transparently. This is about communicating in a way that does not create any sort of suspicion or concern or questioning of what is being done or decided upon. So communication championing is about the outcome of your communication that's going to directly link to trust and rapport. There's also embeddedness, and this is when people throughout the organization are united around a common purpose based on a deep understanding and acceptance of the vision and strategy. So this is about unity, and where people are devoted and loyal to the cause of the organization, its mission, its vision, its goals, its objectives, its strategic plan. And then there's the concept of sense giving in communication championing. And sense giving is the process of influencing how others make sense of the organization, where they fit within it, and the larger purpose of their work. So this is being able to help everyone on your team or within your organization understand their role and where what they do fits within the big picture of the organization. What puzzle piece does each individual worker or team member hold that is key to the success of the organization as a whole? I just had an experience today, as a matter of fact, with an organization that I happen to serve on the board of directors for, and a fellow board member called me because she had been having staff members of the organization contact her directly, basically complaining about some things that the brand new executive director has been doing with this organization. Everything from the way in which he's treating employees, to purchases being made, decisions being made that are affecting clients of the organization, and so on and so forth. And the bottom line was that there's a lack of transparent communication happening, so the staff are very suspicious of this new executive director. And we talked about how it could very well be that there is just cause for some of the decisions being made, and that there's a rationale and justification for some of the purchases that have been made, that maybe if it is communicated effectively to the entire organization, there won't be this air of suspicion or suspect, of this new executive director and how he operates, which is noticeably different from the previous executive director. So we talked about the need to create opportunities for better communication to happen, and to sort of inquire, which we're going to talk about asking questions here in a minute. But inquiry is an important part of communication, because that's where you can get transparent information and have better understanding of some things. So when that communication doesn't happen, collectively or transparently or in a trustworthy manner, it's really going to affect that trust building and rapport building and the overall organizational culture or the internal dynamics of any organization. So strategic conversations. Strategic conversations have to do with communication that takes place across boundaries and hierarchical levels about the group or organization's vision, critical strategic themes, and values that can help achieve desired outcomes. Leading strategic conversations involves asking questions and actively listening to others to understand their attitudes and values, needs, personal goals, and desires. It involves setting the agenda for conversation by underscoring the key strategic themes that are linked to organizational success. And it involves selecting the right communication channels and facilitating dialogue. Open communication refers to leaders who share all types of information throughout the company or organization and across all levels. Now, sometimes some folks involved in the organization might think this is too much information or unnecessary to know all of the ins and outs, but the fact of the matter is that folks should be able to filter out what they need and what they don't necessarily need, and should appreciate being in the know and being informed, whether they need to know every minute detail of day-to-day operations or not. But the benefits of open communication are that it helps alleviate tension and conflict between departments or units within an organization. It helps to build trust and rapport, like we mentioned earlier. It reaffirms employees' commitment to a shared vision, that unity and loyalty and dedication and devotion that we talked about previously as well. And it makes a company or organization more competitive if that is what you're going for. But it also helps build the reputation of the organization as a whole as well. So asking questions, this is essential to good leadership, especially asking the right kinds of questions at the right times. We tend to think of leaders as the ones with the answers, not the questions. But the more inquisitive a person is, the better communication will be, and the more likely things will get done the way you want them to. So there's two kinds of questions that leaders ask that your book talks about anyway, and those are leader-centered questions or follower-centered questions. So leader-centered questions seek to inform the leader about what is going on in the organization. They investigate specific issues, problems, or opportunities, and they gather information, ideas, or insights. Whereas follower-centered questions seek to connect with followers. They help to develop new insights and understandings about what's going on in the organization. They encourage critical thinking and help expand people's awareness and stimulates learning. Listening is another very important part of communication. Listening refers to the skill of grasping and interpreting a message's genuine meaning. So there are 10 keys to effective listening, and this chart on this slide explains in more detail these 10 keys, which are to listen actively, keep an open mind, resist distractions, capitalize on the fact that thought is faster than speech, seek understanding, judge content, not delivery, hold one's fire, listen for ideas, work at listening, and show respect. So with regard to these listening skills, depending on how developed those skills are, you can identify when there's a poor listener or a good listener. So I highly encourage you to sort of look at this chart and think of examples in your own lives, either with yourself as a listener, or yourself as a leader or as a follower, and think about how these skills have been portrayed and the outcomes in which they've resulted in. So this slide shows the differences between dialogue and discussion. So in conversations, there's sort of these two models of conversation, I guess you could call it, where you're either following in a discussion, which might look more like a debate because it's very much about aligning the conversation with getting people to join your way of thinking or to get on board with how you're thinking about things. It's a straight line conversation that provides a speedy decision with minimal conflict. So it really centers around having no time, and you talk more than listening. The focus is on your own interests, and sometimes there's defensiveness, especially in your listening. You might be hearing people but not really listening. You are more about assuming that you have the right answers. Your way is the best way, or the one true way, or the right way. And it's about persuading and kind of a selfish conversation or way of communicating, and part of that might include finding flaws in other people or others' arguments or their discussion content. And so sometimes debates or discussions result in retaining a fixed mindset or in short-term solutions. It might ratify your own position or way of thinking or way of doing things, and it might also result in beating down others. Whereas a dialogue is more of a divergent and convergent thinking process that helps to bring about multiple perspectives, opinions, and answers, and really having a dynamic conversation that goes back and forth. It's more of a slower paced conversation where listening happens more than talking, and the focus is on the whole, not just a minute part of the picture. It's about seeking common ground, and often many people have pieces of the answer, so it's not just one way or one way of thinking or one answer or response or opinion that is the right way. It's often a collective of responses or perceptions from multiple people, perspectives, and angles. So everyone usually feels heard in a dialogue, whereas in a discussion that may not be the case. So the results of an active dialogue are usually that everyone involved in the dialogue sees the bigger picture, and they can see the pros and cons to different angles of that big picture conversation, and they are often more interested in long-term innovative solutions and to fixing problems or the big issues at hand, and all are on board for a decision in some way, shape, or form around the dialogue. So back to championing communication skills for effective leaders. Another aspect of that has to do with candor. Candor has to do with being honest, and it's a forthright expression of a leader's thinking. Stories and metaphors are another component to effective leadership communication. Stories form the foundation of that sense giving, that ability to help everyone on the team or within the organization understand their specific purpose, their role in the big picture, their puzzle piece to that bigger picture. So it's really about, that foundational sense of purpose and belonging and meaning, and that helps with people's buy-in and their sense of cohesiveness and unity with the bigger mission of the organization or the bigger cause. Stories and metaphors influence beliefs and attitudes and behaviors, and they help leaders to unite people. And they help people make sense of complex situations. It's a way to bind people together in a shared purpose and to inspire action. As a leader, the use of story and metaphor to help people connect emotionally with your message and the key values you want to instill is primal. Everyone can learn to use stories, and stories don't need to be long or carefully constructed to have an impact. A story can be a joke, a simple example illustrating an idea. It can be a historical incident or something from a movie or a television show. It can be a personal experience or something read on a blog or news page. The key point is that it should create an emotional context for getting the leader's message across. So this slide shows the continuum of channel richness. So in talking about channels of communication is just the different venues in which communication can happen. So anything from, something in writing, via like a formal report or a memo or a letter or something like that, to something, an electronic message like email or text or a tweet or something to that, a Facebook post or something to that effect. It can be a telephone call, so something voice to voice, or it can be face-to-face verbal communication. And this graphic also shows the richness of those channels of communication, meaning like which ones maybe, how each venue of communication impacts the messaging, as well as how things are received. So for example, a low channel richness might be written forms of communication like a formal report or even a memo or letter depending on what the situation is. Some of the disadvantages to that is it might be seen as impersonal or a one-way kind of communication, and there's slower feedback that is usually provided in those ways. Advantages of that is that it provides a record of documentation, and it's usually premeditated, meaning a lot of thought has gone into it. Probably a lot of editing and proofing have also gone into it, and those methods of communication are usually pretty easily disseminated. So then as you kind of go down the continuum of the channels, you can sort of see, that there's maybe kind of a hierarchy of the different channels of communication based on their richness. Because as you get to the more personal kinds of communication, like voice-to-voice communication over the telephone, or Zoom is not on here, but any kind of virtual communication like Zoom or Skype or through Teams or something like that, and then the face-to-face verbal, some of the advantages are that they're definitely much more personal, and they're two-way, they're dynamic ways of conversation, and you have much more instant or fast feedback, and probably more dialogue happening in those situations. Oftentimes, though, there's not really a record of the communication. Not that you can't record like Zoom meetings or even telephone conversations. Face-to-face, it's a little bit harder to record those kinds of things. So the documenting of those things is a little bit more challenging. They're usually more spontaneous communication happening, kind of off the cuff conversations, and disseminating that information is harder, to do than if it's something that can be done more like a mass communication or whatever. So the hierarchy kind of shows that face-to-face discussions are usually the richest medium and facilitates assimilation of broad cues and emotional understanding of the situation, and it permits direct experience and multi-informational cues, including nonverbals, right? And opportunities for immediate feedback and personal focus and attention. Telephone conversations would probably be the next in line. The voice gives emotional information, your tone, your tone of voice, your speech inflection, those kinds of things can embellish the message that you are giving voice to voice. Whereas electronic messaging would probably be the next, preferred channel of communication. It allows rapid feedback and personalization and provides a way to get information to a wide audience. Print media, like the reports and letters and memos and such, they can be personalized and conveys written cues and provides slower feedback. But again, they're probably perceived to be less personable or less effective because it is more one way. So just some examples for you to sort of think about. So you can kind of judge how you would feel about some of these things. So my partner a few years ago was let go from a job via a text message, very unexpectedly. He was supposed to be at work one day in the morning, and at like 8 o'clock the night before, he got a text message saying that the place that he worked was now under new management, and he was no longer employed with the organization, but if you would like to have his job back, he could apply again, like as of the next day or whatever date they may have given. But the fact that it was provided in a text message, there was no personal communication from anyone, and he and his coworkers had no clue that there was any kind of transition happening with regard to management or ownership of the organization. They had no pre-knowledge that there was going to be a change like that. So he was very put off by the way in which that was communicated. Oftentimes, getting information like that, even in an email, might not be preferable, or even a voicemail. So another personal example, and this was a personal example, not work related, but and now I kind of chuckle about it, but at the time it was not funny. But when my dad died, my brother was the one to let me know that my dad died. And my dad died 21 years ago. It was very unexpected, and the timing, well, death is probably never timely, but it happened to be like 4 days before my wedding. And so everyone was, their mindset was on something completely different, involving traveling and, a wedding and all of this and that. And so my brother was the chosen one to inform me that my dad died, and he left the message on my answering machine, and my home answering machine. And I just felt like that was not a kind of message that you leave in an answering machine or a voicemail, right? That's information that should be conveyed in a more personal way, not as if it's something, I don't know. It really, you know, it was not received very well. And to this day, you know, is kind of a family lesson learned, I guess you could say. But anyway, so you can think about for yourself, you know, and think of examples, I'm sure, that you've had with different ways people have communicated to you and which ones have been more impactful, beneficial, or less so, and go from there. Okay, I've already mentioned nonverbal communication a time or two, but these refer to messages that are transmitted through action and behavior. They're usually expressions that can be, you know, facial expressions, hand gestures, body movements, body positioning or stances, eye contact, all of those kinds of things would be examples of nonverbal communication. Leaders don't just communicate in words. Leaders are watched, and their appearance, behavior, actions, and attitudes are symbolic messages to others. Indeed, nonverbal communication, that is, messages transmitted through actions, behaviors, facial expressions, and tone of voice, accounts for over half of the entire message received in a personal encounter.